Welcome to this video recording, Working with Multilingual Learners. In this short recorded session, we're going to look at some of the initial challenges we know about learning in another language and start thinking about how we will pull those challenges through the content learning in the rest of the course. If you're joining just for the short session, I hope that you take away from it things that you can start thinking about in terms of your own practice. We're going to start by defining our terms. What do we mean when we talk about multilingual learners? We're going to look at the unique challenges of learning through a language that we are also learning, and the key questions that we will be investigating as we go through. So the goal of this particular session is to help us develop an understanding of the situation of our multilingual learners. It's not to answer all of our questions, but perhaps to start asking better questions and to know where we can go to look for more information. So we're going to look at what is the impact of being a language learner and a learner at the same time, and start thinking through that piece of how we can best support both of these student roles. So the first thing that we need to discuss is, what are we talking about? What do we mean when we say bilingual? What do we mean when we say monolingual? So from my perspective, when I say bilingual or multilingual, they mean the same thing. Essentially, we use the two terms interchangeably in research. They both mean people with two languages or more. And so you'll hear me use them interchangeably, and there's no difference. I'm not talking about two languages only or three or more. What I'd like you to think about now is, what are your own preconceived ideas about what does it mean to be bilingual? So if you were to finish this sentence, being bilingual means being able to do what? What kinds of things might you put at the end of that sentence? I'm going to give you a minute to pause the video and try and write down 2 or 3 things that you think being bilingual or multilingual might mean. So pause here and write your thoughts. Now that you've had a moment to write down what you think a definition of bilingual might be, I'm going to share with you some of the very common definitions that I get when I do this session in an interactive way. A lot of people think that being bilingual means being equally proficient in both languages, being able to use both languages at that same high level. Some people think that you can only become bilingual if you've known both languages from birth. There are other preconceived ideas around bilingualism that go along with what we sound like. And so that if you are bilingual, you sound like a native speaker, or you can pass as a native speaker of that language. But overall, our ideas around bilingualism are very often rooted in this idea that being a bilingual is essentially being two monolinguals in one brain. And we do know, of course, that that is not true. Being a bilingual is a completely different conceptualization in the brain of how language works and how things are connected. And so we need to move away from this idea of bilinguals as being equally proficient or balanced or the same in both languages, and really think about what it means to build languages up in different ways. So the definition on the next page is the one I use in all my work, because it really describes quite well the situation of our learners, but also of ourselves if we think through our own bilingual journey. And so before we switch slides, I'd like you to think carefully, would you consider yourself bilingual or not? Before we look at the definition, and then we'll look at it again after. So this is the definition we're working from today. Bilingualism is the ability to understand and use 2 or more languages in certain contexts and for certain purposes. What you have a little think about, what do you think about that definition? And by this definition, are you now bilingual when maybe you wouldn't have considered yourself bilingual before? The reason that this is the way we define bilingualism is that becoming bilingual is not a one-size-fits-all process. We learn language, whether we're 3 years old or 13 or 33, in a context in which we hear it and a purpose for which we need it. And so when I need to go to the grocery store and buy some groceries in a new language, I learn to do that. But learning to buy groceries in a new language doesn't mean I can take my car to the garage in English, does it? It means that I can go to the grocery store. And if I need to be able to do other things, like take my car to the garage or look for an apartment or look for a job or do a job, that will require extending my contexts and purposes. And so for our young learners who are learning a language at school, we need to always keep in mind, what language have they been exposed to? So if they are learning EAL at school, or FAL or any other language, what are the contexts in which they've been exposed to that language and the purposes for which they've needed it? And then as we go through their education, we need to add in more contexts and more purposes. And so essentially it becomes almost like building a Lego structure. I learned to do this in a language, I learned to do that. And perhaps you might learn to do something that you don't need to do again, and then you might lose that ability because you kind of forget that language if you don't use it often. And so there is no way to define an ultimate level of proficiency that everybody must reach to become bilingual, because it's really about, can you do what you need to do? Do you have the ability to be effective in this language in the contexts and purposes that you need it for? It's also important as educators to remember the link to students' home languages. If students are going to school in a language that's not their home language or their first language, they're developing all that academic ability through a different language, which means that their own language development may suffer if we're not very careful in our conversations with parents. Because if you only ever do mathematics in English, then you'll only be able to do mathematics in English. There's no guarantee that you'll be able to do them in any other language. And so we're going to take this definition with us all the way throughout as we think about the different contexts and purposes that students develop language, as we think about our own contexts and purposes as adult language users and what we're comfortable with doing and what we're not comfortable with doing. We can get a little bit better in touch with what it means to become a bilingual and what it means to be developing bilingualism along the way. So how hard is it to become bilingual? Even by my definition, which tends to be not very popular with the parents, it's kind of a, maybe isn't setting the bar very high. What we're going to look at now is how challenging is it to become bilingual when you're a child going to school in a new language? So I often interact with parents who say, oh, my child is going to go to school in German and they'll learn German, or my child is going to go to school in Mandarin and they will learn Mandarin. And they make it sound like quite a straightforward little activity the kids are going to do. In a nice little box, they're going to learn a new language. But we can break down in various different ways the level of language, the context and purposes that we need to develop to be successful academically in a language. The most common way we break it down is across the 4 skills. So I need to learn to read and write and speak and understand in all of the contexts of school in order to be a successful student. And already breaking it down into the 4 skills, we realize that actually there's a lot more work involved than it might have seemed on the surface. We can break it down again into further detail or further context and purposes. In order to write effectively in a language, we have to be able to manage the grammar effectively. There's kind of a myth that some languages are more difficult grammatically and some are easier grammatically. There's not really that much of a difference. But where there is a difference is that idea of language distance. And so if the grammar a child already knows is really different from the grammar of the language they're trying to learn, that's a bigger jump than if the grammars of the 2 languages are more similar. Under writing, we can also think about different levels of formality, writing a friend, writing a text, writing a letter to your head teacher, and also the idea of genre, which we pull through in education a lot, writing for different purposes, writing a historical text or writing an instructional text or writing scientific text. All of those will have their own conventions. So there's quite a lot to be learned in order to be able to be academically proficient at writing in a new language. In order to read, in English in particular, we need to know the alphabet. And if it's not an alphabetic language, we need to know the system in which it's written. And we need to know the spelling or the characters if we're talking about a character-driven language like Chinese. So in order to read, we have to be able to decode whatever the system of the new language is, whether that's similar or different from our own language. And so if we look at alphabetic languages, for example, English and Italian, you may think an Italian child knows the alphabet already when they start reading in English, but actually those same 26 letters in Italian work very differently than those 26 letters in English. And so while they may have some advantages, also have some disadvantages because they'll have preconceived ideas about how things are supposed to look or sound that will not be carried through into English, because of course English, spelling of English is quite complex compared to Italian. In order to be able to speak, students need to learn words. We talk about words. we often think about just learning basic vocabulary, but words are also connectors. Words are grammar. There's kind of a wide spectrum of words we need to learn in order to be effective. And to just give you an idea, we would expect a 5-year-old child to know about 4,000 word families already. And so if a child starts in school at 4 years old, not speaking the school language, they've already got a kind of a gap of 4,000 words that they need to catch up. And so just the word learning is quite a big challenge. And then they need to understand all of the people around them who are using that language. Depending on the language, there might be a heavy use of idioms. So English, of course, is a very idiomatic language. We like to say, get in the car, get on the bus, get out of my face. All of those have the root word get, but by changing the preposition, it means something quite different or means something subtly different. And then, of course, we have to think about the scope of accents that a child is exposed to. So this is not because accents are a problem. Everyone has an accent. That is a reality. When I hear myself recording these sessions, I think I speak perfect unaccented Canadian English. But of course, depending on your exposure to English, you may find I have quite a strong Canadian accent. And so accents themselves are not the problem at all. But we need to recognize when there's variation in accents that a child is exposed to. Depending on their variation, they might have to get used to hearing the same word said in different ways. So they might think they know a word like, my auntie is the sister of my father. But then they hear another teacher say, oh, that's your auntie. And so same word, different pronunciation. It gives another level of kind of challenge. And so when we look at it like this, we can see that actually quite a lot of concerted work and effort is going into learning a new language at school, no matter what age the child is when they start it. And so one of the ways that we deal with this, I say we, I mean educators and also sometimes parents, is we think to ourselves, it's okay. Children are little sponges and they'll just soak up the language, which is fundamentally untrue. Unfortunately, untrue, but untrue indeed. In fact, there's a difference between two different kinds of bilinguals. The first is what we call simultaneous bilingual. This is children who have 2 languages or more from birth. That is absolutely the best kind of bilingual to be. If you've had 2 or 3 languages from birth, you're fairly certain, if you continue being exposed to them and using them, to carry them through with you. Children who are learning a new language at school are what we call sequential bilinguals. They have one language, or they may have more than one from home and from birth. They're adding a new language in. And with sequential bilinguals, there is no mythical sponge-like capacity that helps them learn language. In fact, no matter the age they are, it's a lot of cognitive work. It's not that we can't be done, but we need to think through, how are we supporting our students? How are we scaffolding them? How are we giving them access along the way? And what are the challenges in acquiring a new language at school while you're also learning through that language? So to clarify before we go forward some of our terminology, we're just going to agree on what terms we're going to use for different kinds of languages. There is a term that still gets used quite a lot in different places, and that is the term mother tongue. Mother tongue is a word we need to put behind us. It is outdated. It is not descriptive necessarily of the children we see today. It's a little bit sexist. And it leaves out the fact that if there are 2 partners of different genders, both of the languages are important. So we're going to use the term home language to replace mother tongue. These are any languages spoken in the home from birth. So that could be the language of parent 1 and the language of parent 2 and the language of the grandmother, if there are 3. It could be the language of both parents and the language of the au pair or the nanny. And so this is about languages spoken in the home from birth regularly. The second term we're going to use is first language. So there is some overlap here with home languages, but not completely. So home languages are also first languages. But first languages can also be acquired outside the home. So if you're living, for example, in the Netherlands and you're a Spanish-speaking parent, and you put your child into a Dutch-speaking childcare at 3 months or 6 months old, 5 days a week, 4 days a week, Dutch will be one of your child's first languages, because they get a lot of input from a very young age, but it's obviously not a home language. So home languages are also first languages, but first languages are not necessarily home languages. The third term we're going to look at is second or additional languages. These are languages learned somewhere in the region of 4 years old. So sometimes for 3 years old, we would call it a second, sometimes for 4, definitely for 5 and after. That depends a little bit on the context. Again, if it's within the community or if it's at school. If a child goes to school to learn a new language, we would consider that to be a second or additional language. This is where the A in EAL comes from and the S in ESL. All of these terms are about where a child learns the language and when, where they're exposed to it and when they're exposed to it. What they don't tell us, and what's the most important thing to understand from the perspective of a school and your child's classroom teacher, and from the teacher, from the teacher's perspective for every child in your class, is what is a child's dominant language? What is their strongest language? What is the language they will choose to use if they're given the choice because they know it's the one that comes the most easily? There are children who are bilingual from birth who are quite even in their language development until such time as they start school. But very often, by the time they're 5 or 6, they start to diverge a little bit simply because they get a lot more input in one and less input in the other. It's not unheard of for a child to remain a balanced bilingual, but it is more likely that they will slowly become dominant in one that they hear more often. Knowing the dominant language of every child in our classrooms is really important, because if we're concerned about a child's development, if we're worried about their language development or their academic development, we look to their dominant language to see how they're doing. So if, for example, you have a child who is 5, they've been in school in French for a year and they're not making a lot of progress and you're concerned, you find out what's their level in their dominant language. Are they fluent at a 5-year-old age level? Are they comfortable? Are they confident? And if they are, then that child doesn't have a language delay. They're simply taking more time to learn French. To give an older example, if you have a child come into your school at 10 years old with no English and they're really struggling with literacy, it's good to look at their level of literacy in their dominant language. And if their level of literacy is fine in their dominant language, they'll get there in English. It might take time. But if actually they're kind of struggling with literacy even in their dominant language, that's a sign a child might have something going on, might need additional support. And so without knowing the dominant language, we're missing a really big piece of the puzzle that we use to help us answer some of those questions that arise along the way when children's development isn't what we would expect. So you'll hear these terms come up in different ways over this lecture, and just try to get used to understanding what they mean. When we talk about successful bilingualism for children, this idea of growing up through multiple languages, we think about it as kind of a ladder of success. And children can get to different places on the ladder, and that has different kinds of impact on their development overall. So the first place on the ladder they can get is the ground floor. This is children who have 2 or more languages. None of them are age appropriate for learning. So you may have a 5-year-old child in your class. They speak 3 languages, but none of them really the way a 5-year-old should speak language. That's an area for concern. We're going to come back to those children in a minute. The second place that children can get is what we call middle floor bilinguals. These are children who have 2 or more languages. One of them is age appropriate, and the other ones aren't as strong. That's an okay place to be. There's nothing wrong with being a middle floor bilingual. However, a lot of parents who put their children in our schools, a lot of teachers, a lot of kids themselves have higher expectations or higher hopes. They would like top floor bilinguals. These are children who have 2 languages or more at the right level for their age, either of them appropriate for learning. So that's, for example, an 11-year-old child who speaks French and English, and they can read and write in French and English to the expected level of an 11-year-old. They can speak and understand in French and English to the expected level of an 11-year-old. That is the ideal place. This is the area where we talk about cognitive benefits of bilingualism and other benefits. One of the things we need to ask about our own context is, where do many of our students end up? And in fact, there is kind of a growing area of interest in the fact that actually a lot of children who go into schools as speakers of other languages finish from those schools dominant in the school language, but their own language has weakened over time and not developed fully. So they are middle floor bilinguals. They have that one language, the school language is age appropriate, but their own home language or home languages are no longer at the right level for their age. And that's a shame. It's not what we would want to see. It's not what we would hope to see. And there are ways that we can work together to try and avoid that happening. And that's part and parcel of this, this the whole piece today and going forward. So what do we know about what factors into whether or not children become bottom, ground floor, middle floor, or top floor bilinguals? We're talking about 3 different factors that we know have an influence going forward. The first is the language and education policy of the school. Schools can have an additive policy or subtractive policy. They can sometimes sound very similar. So an additive policy is, you speak Polish, that's great. Come on in. We want you to keep speaking Polish. We'd like you to teach us some Polish. Here's a Polish book. We'd like to also help you learn English. So we want to add English to your Polish. A subtractive policy can on the surface sound quite similar. Oh, you speak Polish, that's fantastic. We love Polish. We think Polish is great. We're happy for you to keep speaking Polish at home, but here we want you to learn English. So it's quite a subtle difference, but to a child, it's a very powerful difference. You want to replace my Polish with English here, giving them the message that their Polish is lower status, not as useful than the school language. So this feeds into the children's perception of how valuable their home language or home languages are compared to the school language. And when children feel their own languages have less value, they stop wanting to use them and they start saying to their parents, please stop speaking to me in Polish at school. It's embarrassing. I hear it all the time from parents. I hear it from adults who should have been bilingual, and they remember clearly telling their parents, stop speaking that language, it's embarrassing. And so the second piece that we really need to be careful of is that we're supporting for all of our students the equal status of their own language alongside the school language, or languages if we're a bilingual school. It's a particular challenge for bilingual schools. If you're already trying to sell 2 languages, where's the space in the discourse and in the hallways and in the classroom to also really value the other languages of our students? But it's really doubly important then. So we need to think through how we're messaging to our students, not just that their language has value at home, but their language has value as a part of their identity, and their language has value for learning as well. Which feeds then into the third piece that we know from research, is that to really get to that top level, you have to be able to read and write a language. So middle floor, you can absolutely just speak it and use it with your cousins and your aunts and uncles on holidays. But to get that top level, you have to be able to read and write so that you can take it forward with you, potentially study in that language or read in that language or work in that language. So all of these 3 factors can influence where any one child gets on the ladder. And if these factors are consistent across the school, it can influence where most of the kids get. I want you to think about that piece in terms of your own teaching context. So the next piece we're going to look at is how long does it take? So my original definition for bilingualism is certain contexts and certain purposes, but we're going to leave that one behind now, because in order to be effective academically at school, you obviously need a lot of context and a lot of purposes. And you also need 2 different kinds of proficiency. The first kind of proficiency you need is what we call BICS, or basic interpersonal communicative skills. This is the ability to play with other children, talk about what you did on the weekend, all that every day, context embedded kind of play, talk, chit chat that we do. The second kind of proficiency is the academic side. It's what we call cognitive academic language proficiency. It's the ability to think, read, evaluate, describe, compare and contrast, do all those deeper level activities that require both cognition and language to access them. These are not learned discretely one after the other. As soon as a child hits the school, they're developing both their BICS and their CALP, but obviously the CALP takes longer. So it takes children 2 to 3 years in full-time education to develop their social language to be at the same level as a native speaking child or as a fluent speaking child. So when you think about that, a child who starts in a new school at 4 years old with a new language, they will be socially proficient like their peers when they're 6 or 7 years old. In all of that time, those 2 to 3 years before that, they are able to socialize, but not as effectively, not as quickly, not as easily, with not as much depth, perhaps, as the children who are fluent speakers of the language. The second piece, the cognitive academic language proficiency, takes 5 to 9 years to develop. Some researchers say 3 to 7, some say 5 to 7. We'll go broad because we know there's a wide range of variability. And recognize that a child who comes in at 4 will be a language learner until they're at least 9 years old and possibly well beyond that. So during all of this time, their learning will be affected in multiple ways by their experience of being both a language learner and a content learner at the same time. So during this 5 to 9 years, when they're developing both their language skills and their learning, it's like they're having a little party in their head and they've got 2 different party hats to wear. When they put on their blue hat, they're focusing on language. When they put on their orange hat, they're focusing on content. So the blue hat is all about what language is the teacher using? What language are my peers using? What are the words? What are the structures? How can I understand it? How can I say things myself? How can I create language myself? And then when they've got some comfortable language, they're putting on their learner hat and thinking, what is an ecosystem? And what does my teacher want to know about how it works? How can I understand the content and how can I create content myself? So this position that our students are in, where they've got these 2 hats to wear, means that they're going back and forth. You can't focus on 2 things at once. So they're focusing now on the language, now on the content. And so their focus across the curriculum is split. If we're working in bilingual schools where children are learning too, we need to also consider then the extent of these phases of language acquisition when they're not in full-time school and what the impact will be on their learning and what's the best way to deal with that. There are no easy answers for that. So if you are in a situation with a bilingual school, that's something that can be unpacked in different ways. So we do know that situation of being a language learner and a learner at the same time has impacts on 4 different areas of students' learning. We're going to touch on these briefly, and then there'll be opportunities to learn about them more in depth in other ways. So we're going to start with the cognitive development piece, which is really important for young learners. So the first thing we know really consistently is the level of development of a child's home language or dominant language when they start school in a new language and going forward is a strong predictor of how well they'll develop that new language at school. So if a child starts at 4 years old as an English language learner and they come in as a Korean speaker and their Korean is amazing, that will have a positive effect on their English. If a child comes in as a Korean speaker, but they're still quite a hesitant speaker and maybe not where they need to be, that will have also an effect on their English, and we can expect it to take longer. This is one of the reasons why understanding the dominant language is so important, because it will help you know immediately, is this a child that's definitely going to need more support, or is this a child we can wait and see? The reasons why there's such a strong relationship between the level of the home language at the start of education and going forward and the level of development of the second language is quite complex. I'm going to show them to you here through a little graph. So when children are born, their cognitive development is at about a 0 level. At the bottom of the hill, their cognitive development is nil. Mother Nature gives us about 11 to 12 years to get to the top of the hill. Our brain has to keep developing all the way up, so that by the time we're 11 to 12 years old, we're at the top of the hill. Our brain is as well developed as it's going to be. Okay? So imagine a child who speaks only Spanish for the first 4 years of their life. They can understand Spanish, they can speak Spanish, they can think in Spanish, they can have emotions in Spanish, they can do all of those kinds of deeper level thinking things in Spanish to a 4-year-old level. And then they go to school in English. And when the parents take them to school, obviously their English is at a 0 level. And so the school says to the parents, we're concerned about your child's development. We'd like you to stop speaking Spanish at home and start speaking English to help your child learn English more quickly. It's a very, very common thing for schools to say because it sounds quite logical. You want your child to learn English quickly. The best way to do it is to do more English. English at school, English at home, they will learn English more quickly. I want you to think through the effects on cognitive development. We can only develop cognitively if we are being talked to and played with in ways that help our brain become better at learning. So imagine this 4-year-old child. Their parents go home and start speaking to them in English. They're going to school in English. Now they're surrounded by English. Nobody's speaking to them in Spanish anymore. So they can't really access anything for continuing to develop because they don't understand anything. So they work really, really hard, but not much development is happening. So at the age of 5, they're obviously not functioning as a 5-year-old would in English yet after only 1 year in English. Remember, it takes 5 to 9 years. But they're also no longer functioning at a 5-year-old level in Spanish. And so now they're a 5-year-old child physiologically, but their cognitive functioning is somewhere between 4 and 5. This is not an ideal place to be in. This is what we call a cognitive gap, a space between the child's actual level, age level, and their cognitive level. And when we talk about the ground floor bilinguals back at the bottom of that ladder, these are the children that we see at the bottom. For some reason, whether that's what the school told them to do, whether it's what the parents decided to do, whatever the reason was, when they started school in a new language, their dominant language on entry didn't continue to be used enough for them to continue to develop cognitively. And so they're really struggling with their cognitive development. And so they may lose 6 months, 1 year, 2 years of time to get up the hill, which means when they are 11 to 12 years old, they're not going to be at the top. So when you look, for example, for research on why bilingual children don't do well in school, you can find it, but it's on certain populations that have been affected by this kind of pattern. So in the Netherlands, for example, there's a lot of documentation that children from Turkish and Arabic speaking backgrounds get much more commonly referrals to the lowest and middle level of secondary school and not the highest. They don't do as well on the test that they do at the end. And they are referred to these lower level secondary schools in numbers that don't align with what would be expected. So they're underperforming because these are the children who are most likely to have had parents told stop speaking Arabic or Turkish at home, start speaking Dutch, or the parents themselves have decided to stop speaking Arabic or Turkish because they want to help their child learn Dutch. That's mirrored in other places around the world. It's mirrored in the United States with Spanish speaking children. It's wherever there's an issue with the immigrant languages being quite low status, those languages aren't protected and developed when the children start school in the majority high status language. And so we really need to be aware of this issue of language status, of parental choice, and ensuring that the home dominant language continues to develop. Because if those parents had kept speaking to their child in Spanish from 4 until 5, then that child wouldn't be 5 years old cognitively in English yet. They would be 5 years old cognitively in Spanish. And a 5-year-old brain can learn better than a 4-year-old brain. So the strength of the cognitive development through the dominant language pulls the school language up the hill. And so it's really, really critical that we pay attention to that piece with young learners. And it's also really important with our older learners, if we're concerned about their development, if we have students who are just struggling with reading comprehension and their English is fine, have a look back at their profile, because sometimes these are the children who have had these cognitive gaps. And so they're just really struggling with higher level academic skills. And so part of our role as educators is really to make sure that we value and prioritize the ongoing development of the home language, the dominant language, alongside the development of the school language. The picture I like to use with parents is this one. Essentially, the dominant language from birth is the bottom of the bottom block in the Jenga stack. And if I try and pull out that bottom block, I can do that, but then I've got a stack that's unstable. And that unstable stack means that building more development on top may not be as successful. And so it's really that foundational development in the dominant language that is predictive of second language development success at school, because it supports their cognitive development along the way. So that's the first really important piece. The second area of challenge is this. I'd like you to take a little moment and I'd like you to try and pronounce this word to yourself out loud, in the mirror, whatever you prefer. I'd just like you to try and sound it out. I am going to tell you it's a real word, but it's in Welsh, not in English. So what I'd like you to reflect on now is when you tried to sound out the word, what skills did you rely on? And I would guess that you relied on your knowledge of phonics. But that knowledge of phonics might have been your knowledge of English phonics, or French phonics, or Spanish phonics, or Dutch phonics, or all the other languages that you may speak, as we're a very multilingual group. And you will have found, I'm sure, that your phonics from a language other than Welsh were not particularly effective in pronouncing this word. So I'm going to pronounce it for you so that you can think through how effective you were. This word is pronounced trausiethi. Very different from English, isn't it? So I sounded it out in English the first time I came across this word, and I said trausiethi. Trausiethi. This word actually means translanguaging in Welsh, and hopefully we'll have opportunities to look at translanguaging later on. So the second area of challenge for our learners is learning to read. What's it like to learn to read in a language that you don't understand well yet, that you don't have the sounds for, that you haven't cracked the code? And, kind of extensively for younger learners, it means that they need more support and more time. For older learners, it means they need really explicit support to be able to crack the code. And we'll hopefully share some articles with you that will help you deepen your knowledge around literacy. And then we need to also think about the additional challenges of reading comprehension when we're reading to decode in a language that we don't know well. So there's kind of the decoding piece, but also the comprehension piece that we need to think about. And just because a child can sound the word out doesn't mean they understand what that word means. The third area of challenge is around content learning and assessment. And so the big question here is, what are they not learning because they've got their language hat on? So their language hat is on while you're explaining what ecosystems are so they can understand the words. And then when they've understood the words, they put them away and they focus, but you've already finished explaining what ecosystems are, and they missed the explanation because they were trying to figure out the words. And so we really have to think about how do we scaffold these students so that they're not missing out on learning opportunities. Is that going to be pre-work? Is it going to be work in their own language? Is it going to be conversations with parents? But we need to make sure that learning isn't put on hold while we are giving them space to learn language. And connected to that, we need to think about assessment. How do we assess learners who are still learning the school language if that particular language might not be the most effective way to do it? So if I ask students to all write a summary of what they know about ecosystems and their English isn't very good yet, what they're going to do is write a summary to the best of their ability in English about ecosystems, which may not be everything they know. It's just what they can manage to put into English. And so the assessment piece is important too, not just the content piece, but also how are we assessing in ways that are equitable and fair. Now I'm going to give you another little activity to do. And this one, again, I'm going to explain it, and then I'm going to ask you to pause your video, do the activity. If you're with somebody else, if you're at home with a partner or a friend or a spouse, please do it with them. It's a lot of fun. But if not, you can just do it yourself and think it through. So this is what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to explain what you did today without using any words that have the letter N in them. You have to do it out loud. Thinking it is not as challenging. So for example, if you took the train to work, you can't say I took the train to work because train has an N. So you have to say I took the big choo-choo to work. So you have to think through that piece and not use any words that have the letter N. So I'd like you to do this for about 30 seconds to 1 minute, talking out loud to yourself or to someone else in your house. Pause the video now and come back after a minute. Welcome back. I hope that you had a little bit of fun with that. And I hope you felt what our language learner students feel, which is how challenging that is. When we do this live and people share their feelings, these are some of the things that people say. I was very slow. I couldn't say what I really meant. I wasn't really listening to my partner because I was so focused on what I wanted to say next. I felt like I sounded a bit silly. And sometimes people say to me, I just lied because it was easier than finding words for what I actually did. But overall, this simulates a low intermediate level of English by the frequency of the letter N in our language. You can do it in French, it's about the same. If you do it in Dutch, it's completely different, much harder in Dutch. And so I like to do this activity. I even do it with older students sometimes to help kind of build that feeling of what is it like to be a language learner student in a classroom where you can't actually really be who you are, where the teacher is talking and the teacher asks the question and you think, oh, I know the answer to that. And so you're thinking about how to say it, and you're thinking about how to say it, and you're thinking about how to say it, and you get it, you put your hand up, and the teacher's already moved on. 2 questions more have passed because it took you that much time. And the teacher's like, what? Oh, somebody already answered that. And you go, oh, I worked so hard. And so the last challenge for our learners, and I think really the key one that we need to focus on as educators, is well-being. What is it like to be in a school where you cannot be who you are? What is the emotional impact on children at different ages of being dropped into a new school where they don't speak the language? And the expectation is they'll just get on with it and be fine. How do we as educators make sure that we're connecting with these children, make sure that we are knowing them and seeing them, even when they can't share with us who they are or what they like? And also then considering the impact on engagement. If you don't feel comfortable and happy at school, you're going to sit in the back of your desk with your arms crossed and you're going to look down. And we all know, we've all been there, huh? As teachers and maybe as students, we've been there. We don't want to engage because we don't feel competent. And so we really need to think through how we make sure that every child gets to be competent every day, that we're connecting with our learners, even when it's difficult for them, that we're using translation devices, that we're using peers, that we're asking parents, what does your child love? And that we work with them to help them feel a part of the class, to help them feel integrated, even when they're really struggling to communicate their needs. So some big questions to take away are, how can we support the whole child while they're learning the languages of instruction, language or languages? How can we be sure we see and know them when they are still not able to communicate effectively with us? How can we ensure that learning is not put on hold while they're learning the school language? They come to us with a fully developed language of their own. We're adding in more languages. We're also adding in content. How do we make sure that they can keep up as best as possible with the content learning, even while they have their language hat on a lot? How can we support multilingual learners in becoming literate and ideally biliterate, not only the school language or languages, but also encouraging parents and putting into place systems that will allow children to become literate in their own languages if they're not already, or to continue that literacy if they are? And finally, how do we ensure that these students are included and happy in our schools, that our schools feel like a happy place for them? They feel like a place where they belong. They don't feel like a place where they are left out of the club because they don't really understand or speak the language fluently yet. And so these are kind of big questions to take away with us as we think about our own practice. Our job as educators is to do this for all of our students, whether or not they share the language of instruction with us. And so for some of our students, we've got to go the extra mile. We've got to work a little harder. We've got to think about putting into place systems that will support them in different ways. I've put at the end here just a kind of few things that I think you might find interesting to deepen your understanding. The first is an ethno-linguistic profile of a family. It's a student-created video. A university student created it. It's a really interesting reflection on how we interact with languages. You can see through her family dynamics and the languages that they use, kind of how we impact on others around us with our language choices. It's just a short video. The second is a podcast, student-created podcast from the United States called Multilingualism in Schools and Societies. They're not making it anymore, but there's kind of a bank of episodes you can listen to. And the last is a blog. There's a wonderful blog called Life as a Bilingual with Francois Grosjean. He's Swiss. He's not writing on it again anymore, but there's such good back content there that's really reflections on life as a bilingual in a monolingual world, as a bilingual within bilingual worlds, on the the emotional side, all different parts of being a bilingual. So I'd encourage you to take a dive into some of the fun stuff as well, alongside the more academic reading. And that's all for this short video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again.